Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back in with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Matt, I suggested a topic from a Wall Street Journal article entitled JP Morgan Chase Disables Employee Comments After Return to Office Backlash. And I thought that would be a great way to explore some of the topics that I've seen floating around on return to work, HR, maybe Meta. So you want to sort of set the stage for our listeners?
Sure, the stage is pretty clear cut that JP Morgan, the large investment bank, they announced last week that I think starting March 1st, all employees must be back at work in the office 5 days a week. And a lot of people are not thrilled with that news at JP Morgan. Although it seems, according to what I've seen in press reports, more than half of JP Morgan employees now are already in a physical office 5 days a week. That includes most of the managers, most of the branch tellers and employees that you'd meet at a local branch. But some plurality or some minority percentage of them still are at home a couple of days a week. That's going to end, according to JP Morgan. Everybody back in 5 days a week starting in March. And they announced that policy on a corporate intranet where employees are allowed to comment on it. And a lot of employees started commenting that they did not like this idea. A lot is several dozen. I don't know if that's a lot for a JP Morgan internal discussion board. I've had some policy announcements where I'd be lucky to get two people to comment, but dozens of people were commenting, most of them negative about this. And at least one person uttering the worst possible word in corporate America, union, that if JP Morgan unionized, maybe they could stand up against this. So, anyways, management decided to shut the comments off. The policy is still in effect. The comments that had been made about the policy are still up for JP Morgan on that internal website, apparently. But, anyways, it just raised some interesting questions about speak up culture. That here were employees speaking up about a company policy and they weren't speaking what management wanted to hear. So, management shut off the speak up capability. And we can unpack what that may or may not mean for a speak up culture, but it was an interesting thing to see.
So there's a ton and a half in there. Let me see if I can parse out a couple of places to start. Number one, the return to work or return to the office. The JP Morgan has been very vocal about requiring levels within the company to come back to the office, and managers have had to be back for some time. The point I would like to maybe explore is if a hybrid work policy is so popular with your workforce, should some consideration be given to what your workforce may want, even if you have a 3 or even 4 day a week policy in the office? Why would a company whose employees clearly want something, which is a hybrid work environment, completely disregard that? Number one. And number two, other reports suggest Oregon doesn't even have enough physical facilities anymore for all of its employees. And energy companies in Houston have run into this. And so you better get there early if you want a hot desk sort of situation. So uh, I know we're going to talk about employee morale throughout this podcast, but what does that say about what a company may think of its employees separate and apart from the speak up part?
I mean, it's interesting because I would distinguish between how much is this an ethics and compliance issue versus an HR and general management issue. And I had not known that JP Morgan did not necessarily have the physical space to accommodate all of this. That is definitely a general management issue. If you want everybody in the office, you got to give them some place to go, even if it's a hot desk, which is one of the worst concepts in corporate America, in my opinion. But nonetheless, I would assume that if a company is going to have everybody back in the office, it is a sign of workplace respect that you have physically prepared for their return. And if the JP Morgan or any company has not, really, people, what signal does that send to your employees about how much you, management, care about them? So they should get this in order. It's an interesting issue though, Tom, because I am fascinated by what JP Morgan is doing, both the return to work policy and the shutting off of the comments when employees started to say, I think that policy stinks. I don't like it. And they didn't like it because it's going to impose more childcare costs or commuting costs and things like that. However, I'll go back to what I said a few minutes ago. Is this an ethics and compliance issue or is it something else? Because compliance officers so often talk about a speak up culture, which is true, but it's a shorthand. And then think about speaking up about what exactly, what specifically. And a compliance officer's interest is employees speaking up about potential misconduct they see, which is not the same as speaking up about your workplace environment. It is not illegal to have everybody back in the office. It is not a crime to do these kind of things. So, could make an argument that as interesting as this spat, this issue is, it is a fight into which the CCO might not want to wade. But on the other hand, you also have to think through, if you're a compliance officer, to what extent do these policies of return to work or these actions, such as shutting off comments on an employee intranet, how much did that drive employees to feel like the company doesn't care about me, the employee? But is that the same as the company doesn't care about misconduct? And it's a very weird, blurry distinction that we're trying to draw here. I'm not entirely sure this is an ethics and compliance issue, but it clearly is a corporate culture issue, which affects ethics and compliance peripherally. So I don't know, like, how's a CCO supposed to feel about this? And what do you think?
I do want to explore that really in depth, but I want to take an interim step because you have used a phrase we have never used on compliance into the weeds. And it was so powerful, I wrote it down. Workplace respect. Now, is that a culture issue? Is that an ethics issue? I would certainly find it to be a culture issue.
Yeah,
And if we use that as sort of a bridge to the role of the CCO, I think workplace respect is absolutely critical to move towards culture. Now, you're absolutely correct about some of the other things that a CCO is going to be concerned about in terms of speak up. But if the Department of Justice says the CCO is the keeper of the flame for institutional justice and institutional fairness, that started out around the implementation of your compliance program and discipline for those who might violate it. But it's hard to keep that in a box. And so if you don't have workplace respect, now let's go to the second step, which is raising your hand and speaking up if you see something wrong. If you feel like your company does not give you workplace respect, are you going to be less likely to walk into your manager's office, pick up the phone, use the hotline? And not that I would see everything going down the legal slippery slope that we're trained to do in law school, but it seems to me to be a pretty easy step or bridge to go from a lack of workplace respect to a denigration of overall culture, including your compliance program, specifically around speak up.
I have a few points I want to get to there. First, going back to the compliance officer as the steward of institutional fairness and what the Justice Department says. I do think it's interesting the Justice Department, in its most recent guidelines for evaluating a compliance program, talked a lot about how you, the compliance officer, should have some sort of way to assess the corporate culture and to measure the corporate culture. How exactly are you supposed to do that if you are stifling some metrics, such as people commenting about policies they don't necessarily like? I can appreciate if you're the CEO of JP Morgan or any big company that you've made a decision. It's not a life or death thing. Like I said before, it's not a crime to have people work in the office. So people are going to be upset about it, but you don't need to hear about it all the time. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of the bank, like he already knows this is going to be unpopular. He already knows people are going to complain he's out to lunch and he's unfair. So from his perspective, I don't need to have even more quantification of what I already know. On the other hand, is it a metric that the bank or any company is now putting aside? And is that going to be problematic? Like, how do you get a sense of what corporate culture is if you're not giving employees a means to speak up about the culture? But Tom, it also gets back to what I said before. This is not something that compliance officer is supposed to care about. You are supposed to care about, do they feel comfortable to speak up about misconduct? And I would, since you stressed the importance of workplace respect, I would draw a line between a hostile work environment, which can set off all sorts of alarm bells in the legal department and litigation and whatnot, a hostile workplace versus a merely unfriendly workplace. Now, maybe a return to work 5 days a week is unfriendly, but you can do it. You're not going to feel besieged by doing it. That is not the same as a hostile workplace. And Tom, I don't know if we could pivot into some of the other things that, say, Facebook has been doing, but I do see some of the other workplace policy changes we're seeing, not return to office. I do see those in a much more negative way where they are possibly going to affect the corporate compliance officer and your job a whole lot more. I don't know that this qualifies, but it's in the ballpark. I can see this issue off in the distance, but there are other issues that are front and center that are really going to give compliance officers some trouble, I think.
Actually, you have persuaded me it's even more important for compliance. And that persuasion came around correctly noting that the DOJ has said compliance has to measure culture. And you can't measure something there's no data on or that's not reported, or your measurement and evaluation will be very far off. So I'm even more persuaded now.
Well,
Let me go.
measuring what though? I mean, measuring what part of the culture? If you want to measure that people are unhappy with management's latest thing, that's like measuring the sun coming up in the east at 6 a.m. It's always there. So I don't like, I mean, maybe we're going down a rabbit hole, but to a certain extent, there's some parts of measuring culture. I don't see what the utility of that is for an effective compliance program. You could have people grumbling about return to work, but that's not the same as, I think, if I had mentioned that somebody's committing fraud, I'm going to get fired, which is a far more serious problem. So I don't know how we're supposed to keep both of those ideas in the same realm.
That's why we're monikered into the weeds. Because if there's not trust, if there is not a way to speak up, should show up in your measurements, in your data, in your analytics. And if you don't have a mechanism that either one, people trust to use, or in JP Morgan's case, can't even use, I think it's going to denigrate trust, which is a huge component of overall culture. But I see that you and I could probably go dig all the way to China on this. So maybe it's time to pivot to your next point around Meta.
Yeah, so this is Facebook. I refused Meta. But Facebook had announced over the weekend, or more specifically, Mark Zuckerberg did, that he is scrapping all the DEI efforts at Facebook. He is loosening the fact checking on what goes on in the platform. He is really going to allow pretty much, I guess, unfettered free speech. I'm not entirely even clear on how much it is. For the record, people, I am not on Facebook. It improved my life immeasurably when I got off Facebook. I'd recommend it to anyone, but I used to be on it. And, it's going to be a much more freewheeling culture online of what people can say. And it seems like he is rescinding and eliminating all of these DEI targets, which I guess is the second worst word in corporate America now. Union the first, but DEI, close second. That's the kind of stuff that I'm more interested in its implications for an ethics and compliance culture. Because if you are rescinding policies on, say, LGBT discussions on Facebook, which could then very easily be seen by Facebook employees, or maybe at even looser discussions within the company itself. Like if you are a gay employee at Facebook, if you're a woman at Facebook, if you're a minority employee at Facebook, how do you feel about these looser restrictions? Tom, I'll give you another great example from the banking world. This is an article in the Financial Times that was published this morning, Tuesday, where they were talking about the magnification of corporate culture. And the article quoted a top banker, unnamed. However, he said, and listeners with small children around cover their ears, but the banker said, I feel liberated. Now we can say retard and pussy without the fear of getting canceled. It's a new dawn. That's not a good thing that you feel emboldened to say that kind of stuff. And I would go back to that banker and I would say, and people, please excuse my language here. I'm only trying to prove a point. I go to the banker and say, are you going to feel comfortable saying the word faggot again? Are you going to be comfortable using racial slurs again? Because maybe they will. That also is not a good thing and should not happen. However, my point is that if you're a gay employee in that culture, how are you going to feel working next to that banker? If you are somebody who has a mentally disabled child, how are you going to feel working next to that banker? Or if you're a woman or a minority and you hear these certain people within the workforce saying whatever they want now, or if you are a woman or a minority and you're trying to get a pay raise or a promotion at work, and the company says, we are no longer going to pay any attention to gender or race in hiring, any attention at all? Really? Facebook? Is that absolutely true? That's a question I have is what is the public statement about we're not doing DEI ever again because it's a terrible thing? What are they saying publicly and what are they actually doing inside? Because if they are actually ignoring race and gender and other issues like that on the inside in hiring and promotion, I could very much see that having a terrible effect on some of the corporate culture. I think, Tom, my way of looking at this is the employee will want to know, is the company on my side? That's their key question. And if they feel like they are not, the company is not on their side, then they're going to start to disconnect from what the company wants and what the company says. And then suddenly they will start to say, company doesn't care about me. I don't care that the manager down the street is committing fraud. I don't care that this VP has said we're not going to promote any more blacks or we're not going, or I'm going to go and harass any intern I find. And employees might disconnect from the fact that those are bad things and they should be reported. But that's, Tom, is where I'm more focused. Like return to office, I can see why people might not like it, but you can accommodate that regardless of who you are. But if the company allows this freewheeling, offensive culture where people are using slurs and not really paying attention to the circumstances of individuals, that could be really offensive and really difficult for a lot of employees. And that's when they start to disconnect from the culture. And that's when it's not like they feel like they could speak up. It's more like, why should I? What is the company doing for me? And that, I think, this is a long-winded way of saying that I think what Meta has been saying and what some other companies are doing going down that road, that is much more troubling to me than JP Morgan and its return to office policy and the stifling of the comments. I don't know what you
I would put the JP Morgan situation and once again use the phrase you articulated as workplace respect as a much broader problem and the narrow problem of people saying those clearly discriminatory words as something a little more focused. But I want to quote now from a New York Times article, which was entitled, Is HR Really Your Friend? And it was a letter into the Times. And the answer read in part, the fact that you worry about consulting HR about your manager's failings and would be career suicide suggests there isn't much trust between people. And that I think is more damning and perhaps more demoralizing than the reality that your manager is falling down on the job. And I think they both point to a bigger problem than the individuals. Heaven forbid we ever go back to that sort of language in the office, even around merchant bankers. And I shouldn't, well, I won't even say it then if I shouldn't say it, but that's going to be a huge problem. And I think companies are, I can't even believe somebody would say that and get quoted in an article on that because you just have to have respect for your coworkers.
that particular quote really did offend me because you notice the banker didn't give his name. First off, I'm confident it's a man because I have not yet met a woman who would so casually think that's fine to do. But I mean, dude, if that's what you really think, then own it. And he's not. He's hiding behind an anonymity. That's offensive. But Tom, to the point about HR, is HR really your friend? I mean, come on. I think everybody listening to this podcast knows that HR is not the employee's friend. It is human resources. You could just as easily ask, is the facilities manager your friend? Because they're in charge of capital resources. And nobody would say, is the facilities manager your friend? No, of course not. They're there to work on behalf of the company. So is HR. HR is just there to help employees feel comfortable, but it shows, again, the tension that I think does exist between the compliance team and the HR team. That if compliance is there to help everybody focus on the ethical issues, occasionally that will run contrary to the company's immediate financial interests, which is often what HR is there to help protect in conjunction with legal and finance, usually. But overall, Tom, I do just think that we are in for a rough ride now, that there's going to be this, at least a spasm and possibly a longer period of people thinking that with the return of MAGA and the Trump administration, it is freewheeling open season. I can say whatever I want. And if you don't like it, too bad. That's the thing that worries me more than return to office policies. And we're going to probably wind up putting a certain number, and possibly a large number, of employees under a lot of stress. If I were a woman, I would not want to work next to that banker who made that stupid comment in the Financial Times. If you are a minority, I can only imagine how you might feel if your company says we are no longer going to consider racial factors in hiring and promotion and our workforce composition. There's all sorts of ways that you might feel threatened by that. You might feel on the back foot. And if you are, that's where your interests and the company's interests start to divorce. And then after that, like I said before, is the company on my side? That's the question that, and it's not a yes or no thing for employees. It's more, do they feel like the company's on their side? And a lot of companies, CEOs right now are shooting their mouth off to kind of feel like, no, they're not. That's my company. The company's on my side. I am the company. That's the sort of sentiment these CEOs seem to be firing off from on high. And I fear for employees that how comfortable they might feel in that environment. And if they don't feel comfortable, going to be implications of that that absolutely spill into the ethics and compliance function.
I'm going to take it a step further because I can certainly see this Supreme Court overturning Title or the Equal Rights Act, Title VII and Equal Rights Act as unconstitutional. I can certainly see this administration agreeing with that position and not defending it for the Supreme Court. Matt, I want to end on and circle back to the return to office because I saw another article in the Financial Times that caught my eye on this, and that is that Lloyd's Bank of London, not Lloyd's of London, Lloyd's Bank, has instituted a policy where for senior managers, their adherence, or they use the word compliance, to return to the office will be a part of the measurement for their discretionary bonus. And I found that incredibly interesting that they would use financial incentives to get people to come back. So perhaps that's a step some companies could consider as well. Maybe it's like perfect attendance in elementary school. You get a
I,
certificate at the end of the year.
Tom, I will just say I'll believe that when I see it, because I think, especially for senior managers, so much of this can be negotiated away on a case by case, fact specific circumstance. That's another thing. If you're on the bottom of the pecking order, I am sure return to the office means 5 days a week. If you're at the top of the pecking order, I'm sure it means I'm going to aim for 5 days, but if there's something that goes on, I might have to call you up and explain. And then the other manager will say, oh, yeah, sure. There's going to be so much subjective judgment into that that I really question how seriously to take those kind of things. That's all I'll say.
In that situation, I'm a little more optimistic than you.
All right.
Matt, this has been a ton of fun. I hope we can get philosophical again.
Thank you, Tom.